prefer if you refer the panel as a whole. Thank you. Good luck to all.
And then group of photo here. Yeah, because the grace period time has lapsed, I don't think we'll have the third panelist. With that said, the motion before the House today, this House opposes school choice in liberal democracies. Speakers can introduce themselves and their POI preferences as and when they're called. So without any further ado, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister to defend the motion that stands in their name. Here, here.
Sorry, I just want to check if I'm audible.
You are.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. My name is Thandolwethu France, pronouns he, her, and I prefer verbal yours. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, picture this. Katlego is a young girl who lives in Soweto. She goes to school with dusty books and dusty classrooms. Her teachers ignore her in every classroom. Whenever her exams come around, she struggles, cannot find a library, cannot find a textbook, cannot find anything to help her in those situations. What we get from side opposition is a world where she stays in these places. It's a world where she cannot escape her impoverished education and is therefore doomed on their side. So proud to so proud to open, right? Firstly, I want to do a bit of framing, a bit of characterization on what we're actually arguing for and which world we're actually defending. Firstly, let's characterize what liberal democracies actually look like. What we see in liberal democracies is that they promote, they have a universal suffrage in these economies, and also they emphasize the opposition of having separations or having some sort of hierarchy in society. Liberal democracies tend to have a notion in which they want to empower not only the rich, not only the poor, but also the people in between. If they have this notion that they want to improve the lives of not just one individual, but many individuals at the same time. What do we see in governments in these liberal democracies? We see that their duties include two things. Firstly, to provide basic needs and services, and secondly, to benefit individuals that prioritize, and more specifically prioritize those that are underprivileged, which is directly included what I just said now. Okay, so first argumentation, excuse me. What does our world actually look like? Firstly, we have to look at what government would primarily do in order to have this public educational schooling, right? It looks like, for example, in Switzerland, where the government would primarily invest. It would look like, for example, in the US, where the government would most primarily have the direct influence into educational system by providing books, by providing schools, and providing so forth, right? And I'm going to explain on how we actually are going to be beneficial in that case, right? Okay, second argument. So this is a principle-based argument on how we're actually maintaining government mandate, right? So we see a form side opposition. The government first mandate is to protect and provide for their citizens. We believe on our side that even if the government is corrupt, we're still maintaining that government mandate, and we are morally just because we don't believe that citizens should take the responsibility of the government into their own hands. The government's main mandate is to provide for these individuals, especially when it comes to the educational system, where they have to provide basic needs and services. Taking away that responsibility from the government and placing it onto the citizens is morally unjust in and of itself. Even if, at our worst case, why do we still win? We still win because if the government is doing a bad job, excuse me, if the government is doing a bad job of providing education, they will be held accountable. Why is this a good thing? And why don't you get that particular thing on side opposition? Because if the government is not held accountable for their actions, if the government does not receive backlash from society on why they're not actually providing good educational systems, the government will not necessarily have an incentive to actually change. What you see from side opposition that citizens are taking control of their own education because they have continuously been failed by the government. But that does not necessarily change the situation for individuals that cannot support themselves, firstly. And secondly, that does not change the government's incentive to actually change anything. in that educational system. So why is this a good thing? Is it a good thing? Because if the government is held accountable, we get backlash from society and are more likely to improve the educational systems, not only for the rich, but also for the poor. This is why the US and Switzerland have such great educational systems, not only because the government provides for them, but people are actively going to be calling out the government when they're doing something that is not beneficial for those individuals that are going to those particular schools. Before I move on to my third argumentation of how opposition actually limits the resource distribution and increases segregation in the educational sector, are there any more POIs?
You talk about accountability. Show us how there is no accountability at a point in which governments still support access to private schools through government subsidies and scholarships.
Wait, sorry, one person at a time. There were two people talking at once. Please repeat your POI and quickly, please. Time is moving.
All right, I was saying, show us how there's no accountability even at a point in which government offers scholarships and finance to for less privileged communities to access private schools.
No, but the thing is, if you're limiting government's access to education, they are still able to particularly succeed in those spaces, right? A subsidy, or let's say, for example, a scholarship are small resources that the government has to control. You're not going to be held accountable for those certain things because those are very difficult to actually mess up in the first place. What we're telling you is that we need the government to do their job. If we're telling them that they can run away from their duty by having the citizens actually provide education for themselves, what you're doing is that you're removing the responsibility from the government and you're placing that burden onto society. Next argumentation: how does side opposition actually limit resource distribution and increases segregation? Right? Let's actually characterize what opposition world is going to look like. It's going to be looking like this hierarchy of education where the rich get richer and get the amazing opportunities of education, where they can take their kids to Ivy League institutions and so forth. And you see, especially in African countries, where the bottom half of society, especially middle class and lower class individuals, are unable to access education, especially higher education, mainly because of the lack of resources. Why is this inherently bad? Because this is morally unjust to shut out the rest of society, mainly because they cannot have access to those particular things. And we've told you in our characterization, these liberal democracies are trying to create change for these individuals, not only at the top, but also for those at the bottom, right? So what do we do on our side? So we are able to directly invest into government education. We're directly able to invest into education, right? So what does this look like? It means that the government will be able to not only donate in small lumps of money in terms of loans and things like that for schools. They're able to actually build these schools. They're able to actually target where the needs are for these particular individuals. And the last argumentation about and this is going to be directly clashing with side opposition's main argumentation about diversification and customization of education. How do we still get a unique experience of education on our side? Two things. Firstly, because the government has more resources than the average individual and has access to research, right? So we have, and the second thing is that they provide more capacity to expand education. So what does outside opposition actually look like? The average individual is going to be the person that is going to be providing for this education, right? Why is that a bad thing? Because if the government can be able to have more research and more money, they're able to specialize or tailor their education to those that need it the most. So disabled individuals, blind individuals, or any other individuals that cannot be incorporated into the educational system as it is, they are able to be accounted for in our side of the world, mainly because the government will have more resources and more research in order to actually benefit these individuals. What have I proven to you in this debate? I've proven to you how we are better off as side opposition because we provide not only for the individuals that are in the middle class, but also the lower class. And we believe that it is important to not remove the responsibility of the government onto citizens, mainly because that is the government mandate. Okay, thank you so much.
We thank the Prime Minister for that great speech. A reminder that at 7:15, all judges, we stopped writing, so there's no point in carrying on past 7:15, and no one wants to have to interrupt the speech, so be mindful of time. The other panelists did join in time, so maybe you may introduce yourself before we continue the debate.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Sandy. I'm one of the panelists for this debate. I'm sorry for being late, but I did get the Prime Minister's speech just fine, so good luck.
Chair, can we please get the timer in the text channel so like that all of us can keep the same time record, and like it would be easier for the speaker as well.
Okay, sure. Okay, I should have the timer ready to go. Okay, to
Yeah,
open the
thank you.
negative case in today's debate, let's hear from the leader of opposition. Here.
Audible.
Yes, you are.
Mm, Okay, POI is exclusively in the chat space. I am looking directly at the chat space, so just type POI and I'll take you as soon as I can. Mm, Okay. Um, yeah, cool. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Even though the opening government tried to create a type of contextualization around liberal democracy, I think that contextualization was actually too broad and it was not within the context of this debate, or it was not in particular to the context of this debate or what the motion is really about. Hence, I am going to be further characterizing what liberal democracies are and why that characterization is going to be important to this debate. The thing about liberal democracies and why they are called liberal democracies is because they have a diverse demography of people based on race, culture, based on religion, and based on wants and needs essentially. And there is always a constant pressure, or there is always a constant need within those democracies to be able to create as much inclusivity as possible, because most liberal democracies are always formed in the aftermath of, social movements or political movements that have to do with, the choices of some particular sect of individuals within society. So literally, liberal democracies are known to always be in constant evolution. It is always changing, both based on the changing needs of people, based on the changing beliefs and idea of people. That is also the reason why there is a constant evaluation of the policies and laws that are based in those particular countries. That is the reason why their society is structured to be able to easily reevaluate policies and change policies. That is also the reason why there is always an open access between government and their citizens to be able to communicate their new needs, and for government to also be able to interrogate those needs and how they can be able to engage those particular needs essentially. But lastly, in terms of characterization, I think most of these countries also have a funding capacity. Why? Because they're always their economy is always in constant elasticity to be able to be reshuffled and able to be restructured to accommodate new needs, or to scrap out old needs to be able to accommodate new ones essentially. I think the motion slides already even pointed out how those type of funding capacity will look like. So, for example, the government increasing taxing, for example, the government offering scholarships and all of those. Like, these are things that already exist in most budget of liberal democracies and has the ability to be elastic essentially. So now, why do we think that, aside from that, the opening government already falls out of this debate? In addition to the characterization I gave, the opening government falls out of this debate because they seem to believe like the government is going to leave this in the hands of private individuals to be able to do it. That's not true, because government will be ultimately involved. The info slide already says that. But also, due to the ideology in liberal democracies for governments to always protect the choices of their people, it means governments have every reason to want to be part of it, even in the very least for them to be able to have a form of quality control, to be able to control the type of the standard, to also be able to control the accessibility and all lot of those. Government has the legitimate reason to do that because of their ideologies, but also even if they are bad government or greedy government because they probably want to be re-elected, or they want to have a voter base among people who need these particular things essentially. Now let's move to the major argument in my case, from our side. Why exactly don't we oppose it? We don't oppose it because we think that, as I've just started saying, in line with the ideologies of liberal democracies, parents should always have a choice. Considering the fact that parents who are most likely religious, or who particularly have a belief due to the fact that they want to train their child in the best way possible, we make sure that they also have ways that they can be able to indoctrinate their children in line with those particular beliefs. But also, you also have, for example, groups like racial groups like Black people of color, but also probably religious groups who, due to the need for the sustainability of their country, or rather their beliefs or their culture, we want to indoctrinate or educate their children in line with all those policies. That means that parents, being the fundamental unit of life or of choice of family or society, has that obligation to want to build society in such a way that their choices and every of their needs on every of their culture or identity will be reflected in society essentially. It means that the government has every legitimate reason to want to uphold the choices of people within society, because that is the only way you are able to have a cohesive society. That is the only way as a government in a liberal democracy to be able to maintain optics for people to say this is a government that really cares about their people and are able to have a form of integration based on the choices or belief of individuals within that society. CG, what's your POI? CG, your POI.
We think that people in liberal democracies don't have absolute rights and freedoms, and we think it's a matter of state preservation and state defense to make sure that everybody gets the same standard of education.
I think something I need to add here is that, considering the fact that everybody, and this is even leads to the second argument I was about to bring up, because the idea is this: in liberal democracy, everybody understands that there are also other people in society that has different ideologies or different principles from you. That necessarily means that most of the time liberal democracies are always built on tolerance and the ability for you to be able to understand trade-offs and to be able to understand that even though you have rights, your rights are not absolute, as CG also says. Most importantly, it means that innovation will be tailored towards diversity, because people now come up with mechanisms that isn't just absolute in terms of what they necessarily want, but mechanisms that are tailored to be able to reflect diversity in itself. The reason why you find people from African countries preferring to jackpot to places like US, Canada, UK, as opposed to places like other democracies like China and Japan and all those places, is because in those society there is always the absolute choice to be able to pick from diverse means and to be able to have diverse ways you can be able to pick, your choices and different communities and different things based on your wants. It means that on our clash to inclusivity, it means that there will be increase in school based on diverse interests, but also schools begin to have a fundamental reason to not be elitist, because the reason why you came into existence in the first place is because other people were able to tolerate you to be able to exist. It means they also know that they have that fundamental principle or reason to accept other people, because the society is built on the fact that you have to be inclusive, you have to favor other people, you have to include other people in things that you exist, but also because they want to propagate their culture or their religion to be seen in good light. That is enough reason why they want to make sure that other people are able to join this school. But even aside from that, the very fact that the government already has control over this means they can also institute policies or laws that will make sure that these schools are not elitist and doesn't cover for some set of people. You get more from my partner.
Thank the leader of the opposition for that great speech. And another reminder for speakers to be mindful of time and also time themselves, so that at 7:15 they conclude, well, by 7:15. To continue OG's case, let's hear from the Deputy Prime Minister. They're here.
Just checking, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, without further ado, I'll be starting my speech. Oh, by the way, my pronouns are she, her. Anything that refers I'm a female. I prefer verbal POIs, but please do not badger. You ask words and I will accept you when I'm ready. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. At a point where we get teams that actually constantly misunderstanding what this whole debate is about, we already think that government that is currently winning this debate because of further reasons that I'll be mentioning onto my debate, right? So panel, notice how the misconception or the misunderstanding comes from mostly from OO side and how exactly they seem to misunderstanding what government side is actually talking about, right? They have this whole idea of exclusivity in their world, how you're supposed to belong to a specific group because you are supposed to be exclusive, right? So like you're supposed to belong to a group that deals with only your problems, right? But very man, government side is still going to engage with this, right? So we tell you that government on our world, the government has a more access to resources than what they're actually telling us, right? We tell that the government will be able to customize this schooling or these educational systems and for certain individuals of certain needs, right? So in our world, we tell you that kids that are like in special needs, like an autistic kid, will have a school that is specifically that will actually attend to their needs, right? That are going to educate them in certain ways that they need to be educated. They're going to take care of them like in ways that they need to be taken care of, right? We tell you that whatever point they're trying to bring up or whatever most vulnerable access they're trying to benefit, we benefit them best because we still have more resources, right? We still have more resources within the matter. So therefore, we're still able to benefit these kids more. We're still able to have better educational systems where it actually attends to these individuals that with special needs and still have that exclusivity and still fulfilling the government's mandate. Right. So I'll be going further on discussing what exactly is the government's mandate in this debate and what exactly the government's mandate is at all. Right. Before I go to that, I would like to first discuss two main points that all brought up in the speech that we think is constantly is morally unjustifiable and simply cannot be implemented, seeing how our economy is currently going about, right? So the first one is how the government should increase taxes. But panel and chair, notice how this is like not like applicable to our economy system, basically where you have the rich people do not pay taxes, the poor people do not pay taxes. It is the middle people that are constantly having to pay taxes, and it's the same people that still earn minimum wage. Now notice how by increasing the taxes, by increasing our tax level or tax VAT percentages, we are putting the middle class at more harm and detrimental because they do not have enough money to even support their families if all the money is going to taxes. Notice how the rich people do not pay taxes because they use tax evasion system by paying like through charities. And notice how the poor people simply cannot pay taxes because they do not earn enough money to be paying taxes. So they're seeing that we need to increase taxes for us to have these special schools for kids. It's just not applicable because they're not taking into consideration that the detriment that can actually happen to the economy, how exactly it's going to affect today's economy in the first place, right? So what have I proven to you under that specific point? I proven to you that the point of increasing our tax is currently unjustifiable and cannot be applied because of our current economy system and how the world is currently moving out, right? The other thing that I would like to tell you is how they tell that about religious schooling, right? So you want a kid to go, if you're Christian, you want your child to go to a Christian-based school. If you're a Muslim, you want your child to go to a Muslim-based school, right? So we tell you that this is not right because there's a saying: if you want extra, then you should be willing to pay for extra, right? So if I'm a parent and I want my child to go to a private school or private like Christian school, I should be able to pay extra. It is nowhere in the government's mandate for them to provide for people of like special needs, right? It is nowhere in the government's mandate for you to provide for people specifically if you want to go to a private school or you want to go to a school that actually teaches you about your religion, right? So what exactly is the government mandate? The government mandate in this debate is to provide you with basic education, and that is exactly what they have been doing. Our government is not perfect when they're like, hey, they're going to provide for 100% of the people, right? But we tell you that they're still fulfilling the mandate for providing with basic education. We give example of this such as private schools, right? Government funds in school where the government is still fulfilling its mandate by giving you by providing you with basic education, right? So before I finish my debate, any pure eyes, preferably from OO. Going once, twice. Okay. So, with that being said, I would like to conclude this point. What happens to me to appreciate to that in our world, we still fulfill the government's mandate, which is to provide you with education. And whatever idea or whatever policy that always trying to implement, we still think that it doesn't work within today's economic system in our countries, right? Also, what have you proven to you as OG in the first place, right? We're proving to that in our world, we're going to be holding government accountable, where they're actually going to be able to fulfill the mandate even more. And we also tell you that more money will be able will be going to government, because by holding them accountable, we're going to make sure that every tax money that is paid, the little tax that is paid currently, is going to such things as building roads, and most specifically and most importantly, building schools and improving our educational system, right? So we tell you now, well, this government system is going to be held accountable. Therefore, we're going to be providing a best educational system for our kids, rather than being inclusive, rather than being exclusive to others, other points, and bringing up the fact that, oh, we need to increase taxes, not taking into account how the outcome of that can actually be, right? So, panel chair, you side with the world that has proven to you these things. We've proven to you that how that we're going to benefit schooling for everyone. We told you that how we're going to have effective schooling system in our world by holding the government accountable. We have also told you that how, even if in their case, whatever in the this is how they're going to be providing for certain kids of special needs, right? We tell you we're still able to provide for them more, simply because the government has more access to resources. The government has a lot of access with for a lot of other resources that can actually preemptively help us in achieving this goal. We tell you that it's not seen justifiable on our side for individuals themselves to take into account, or to take the responsibility of actually having to provide for their kids, right? We tell you we do not support the fact that an individual or a parent should go there providing like building schools for these kids, or like building educational system for these kids, right? Reasons being is because that therefore it is undermines the government's mandate. The government will not be fulfilling its mandate if everybody takes into account, like, if I'm a parent. I'm a parent and I decide to send my child to school, and I take account to that, right? So, if you side with the side that actually has proven to you the benefit that it brings to the world and the school life, then you side with OG. Thank you.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that great speech. To conclude OO's contribution, let's hear from the DLO. Here. DLO, are you present?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. There are majorly three things you get from government teams, which they all clamor for. They want a world where everyone is included in the educational system of the state. But then, secondly, they don't want a world where there is a gap between the rich and the poor. In engaging this argumentation, you would realize that most of the argumentation are not exclusive. So let's assume a world where there are no choice schools. We think that because of the non-existence of choice, they feel that because of the non-existence of choice schools, that's how come people cannot, go for Ivy Leagues, or go to Harvard and particular things. We think people will not still be able to go to Ivy Leagues and Harvard and Harvard in their world anyway, because the rich exist, the poor exist, right? But then secondly, we don't see how they bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. The extent of the argumentation of doing this is, oh, we think you need to assert more pressure on the government, right? They did not explain what mechanism of pressure that they want, right? Because we think the reason for choice schools is because government has failed to give attention to these particular localities anyway. That's how come these people come together as a locality, as a region, and create a school where their children can go to in subsidized funds and particular things, and government can even invest in all these particular subsidized schools. They never explain how more pressure would necessarily create more change or divert more attention to this particular people, right? They just said, oh, we think you need to pressure the government more, you need to start taking accountability and sort of things. But then, another response to this is that we think in a liberal democracy, what government do in those kind of heterogeneous society that have diverse belief and diverse races and diverse belief system in one state, the US, for example, is an example of this. Governments sponsor the choice of individuals to perpetuate their own belief system, right? Because, for example, not all schools in the US, for example, incorporate a particular belief system that's attributed to some localities. So you more likely see people, so some people of Brazilian or origin going to Brazilian local schools because they feel that school enrich their cultural aspect of what they believe, right? Or some, like, heterogeneous religious schools who people who subscribe to the tenets and appearance of religion would go to. This doesn't happen in mainstream religion, right? And this is more likely one of the reasons for all those choice schools. Meaning government sponsor choices, and that's why the info slide said governments even invest in all these particular schools and pay for them, send them books and other things because it is easier to sponsor their choice, right? But what they want on their world, right, as a sort of comparative, is that they want a world where government should be the ones building schools, government should be the one doing those particular things. One, to response to this particular argumentation, we think private schools can exist, right? We think local schools and regional schools can exist exclusive of government control, right? One because it's a liberal democracy and a lot of things are not necessarily controlled by government, right? But then secondly, we think that their word then presume, like this is the extent, if you look at the impact of the argumentation, right? Their word presume there shouldn't be any other schools that's necessarily established by any other individuals or any other NGOs, for example. Government should be the one having the or authoritarian control of everything, since in their world they want government to take full accountability. We don't think having a separate school exclusive of government control necessarily devoid us of holding government accountable. We think it's still it's mutually inclusive in our world. We can still hold government accountable even in our world to necessarily do some certain things, provide resources for our locality, since that particular locality pay tax to the government, and that resources they are providing to the locality can be used to enrich their educational system. I think that can happen in our world, and accountability can still be held within our world in that regard, right? Then let's go on to the nature of resource distribution in liberal democracies and federal governments, or federal, especially federal governments and liberal democracies automatically. You realize that in liberal democracies, right, the federal government allocates revenues to different states, right? Notice these revenue allocations are usually based on the extent of tax they get from each state. So if US gets more tax from New York will receive more revenue as opposed to Boston or Massachusetts, who like give more tax to government, right? Meaning that government is already like in a position where they give less revenue to lesser states or lesser regions who pay lesser tax anyway, right? So it means that the idea to necessarily want to change the bill representation or bill revenue allocation from the parliament is rigorous and very stressful. To say, oh, you start building schools, this particular tax allocations is not necessarily enough for the government to build all the schools in this particular locality. That's why governments have federal character. That's why government then exude part of its autonomy. That's why this particular locality can build schools for themselves, right? Because government cannot do everything, right? Because of that level, because of how their resource distribution is kind of they're in a position where they don't distribute resources evenly, and that kind of revenue allocation is one that is necessarily skewed in that regard, right? Meaning, if in their world, if they are waiting on government to build schools for them and those particular things, it may never happen, right? Even to the next administration. But it is easier in our world, right? It is easier in our world, for example, to build our schools based on, let's say, personal funds and those particular things, and then the government can fund it, right? But then, secondly, based on the kind of revenue we still get from the government anyway, we can still use to fund this particular thing.
You are.
Their world wants to wait for the government to start building schools for them. It won't happen. Our world is better. At least we build our schools, and our children can, attend those subsidized schools and particular things, and then they can even have access to scholarship and also have access to governmental funding, since government can still fund an already established establishment as opposed to they are already the one government to establish everything. Shoot a POI from CG. Shoot.
Yeah, you guys know where you can get
Hello.
money to build schools.
I didn't
We
hear you.
think the state is under attack by allowing too many people to do whatever the hell they want. Can you hear me?
I don't get it.
Pure.
I don't get it. Well,
I'm
if the
saying
idea is no, it's not to further. If you're saying that, oh, people can do whatever they want, is there's kind of a problem to that. We think if people can build schools and build whatever schools they want based on their ideology, it's enriched choice on our side. and people can choose whatever schools they want to go to, especially when they can't go to the mainstream anyway, since it's too expensive, right? And all those particular things. The fact that they are necessarily having that resource distribution, like allocation inequality, already mean in your world, people cannot have access to Harvard anyway, right? Our world is better. We give them access to education in a subsidized way, and we still have access to funds in a standardized way within that particular regard, right? But then, secondly, last thing is to look at the proponents of people who support this particular thing. These are rich guys, rich capitalists who are willing to fund these particular local schools, meaning it's going to be up to standard since these people who are funding it are rich anyway. These are senatorial district senators who are already in government, who can pressure the government to look into these already established establishments to invest in it, right? We think that capacity exists in our world to create standard because people who are funding it are wealthy
Hello.
capitalists, district senators in the particular regard. We win this debate.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that great speech. To extend the debate, let's hear from Member of Government. Here. The Member of Government can start whenever you're ready.
Go.
Yes, you are.
Perfect. So I'll be taking POIs in the text space. If you have a POI, just look at the text space. I am going to take POIs there. And please do not unmute for any reason. I would prioritize taking closing opposition just so we can have worthy engagement. Just give me some minutes. Let me set my timer. Great. Perfect. I am starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Oh, sorry, can you? Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Oh, my this thing is shaking. I'm sorry. Just give me. Please, just give me a few minutes. Marriott, hey, how do you still do this? How do you still do this? All right, I'm starting now. Sorry for the. Yeah, sorry for delay, guys. I am starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The most prominent feature of liberal democracies is that they operate using a highly educated workforce, which makes them invest heavily in their educational system. This is evident in the fact that liberal democracies are more affiliated to Western states because all the evident characteristics of liberal democracies are seen in those countries. There's a reason why we can't even say that any African state is a pure liberal democracy. But more importantly, why is this true? And why is this going to be relevant for this debate? There are 4 things I have to say here. 1, because free and fair elections are a heavy part of liberal democracies. And the only way they can brag about their political identity and preserve their pattern of having stable elections is to keep the electoral base as educated as possible. This is the reason why we always cry about elections that happen in democratic African states, because we believe that part of the reason why they keep having shitty elections is because some part of the voter base are not educated and thus relegated to rural areas where votes are bought and gerrymandering is more likely going to be a thing. The second reason is because the sustainability of these liberal democracies usually involves heavy politicization of their economy, which extends to having a viable economic option to keep their economies as stable as possible and build a first world identity for themselves. This can only happen when they have a very robust educative workforce. The third thing is that because the context of liberalism as practiced in those countries mean that people can only make reasonable choices when they are educated enough so that they can know what policies work best for them in that particular system of liberalism, because it's a liberalism allows people to have variety of options to choose, basically being liberal. The fourth thing to say is that because the criminal justice system, particularly in liberal democracies, are very, very active, for you to be able to benefit from those systems, you need to be educated. These countries uphold their constitution a lot. So for you, you need to know your rights so that police cannot harass you anyhow, or even when you are arrested. We think all these things comes with the fact that you need to be educated in and of itself. These four things establish the framework for this debate to happen, so that you can understand why education is a very important concept in these states. I think opening government does a good job in showing you why we should oppose these school choices. What opening government lacks is the mechanization of why liberal democracies are an important context in that debate. With this framework, you can then understand what opening government was telling you in the opening half of this debate. But secondly, the problem in the opening half is that there is no consequential framework in terms of consequential impacts on why school choice in and of itself is probably not a good thing for these states. Opening opposition gives you the basic idea of, liberalism, people should have rights, people should be able to access a lot of things. We think those are basic ideas. Like my partner said in the POI, the idea of being a liberal democracy does not mean you have absolute rights in and of themselves. There's a reason why states cede certain rights that exist within that particular narrative. My partner will do a lot in terms of responses. Let's give you our extension proper. When you understand the framework I gave you in this debate, you understand why education is important for two reasons. One, that you don't have any form of system that creates any inequality between the educational standards. This comes with you understanding that there's a reason why we need to ask ourselves, why do parents want to go for an alternative school options in themselves? The reasons are simple, because they know that in the public system, there's a level of identity that they don't get in and of themselves. But more importantly, because they need to address specific learning needs of their children. Some of them feel their children are not getting the best form of education, and that's why they need these alternative schools in themselves. We don't think it's possible for you to have any form of unique identity within these two brands in themselves. But this is what opening half tells you. The framework just helps you understand it. Here's the first form of extension from closing government: state preservation. We think it is important to understand that there is a rise in anti-state narratives that are currently plaguing these liberal states. This is important for two reasons. One, you need to understand that things like fascist ideas, communist ideas, all these things are beginning to go rampant in these liberal democracies because of the proliferation of different rights and movements who want to indoctrinate most of these ideologies, right, within these particular narratives in and of themselves. We think this is something that's currently happening in places like the United States, where there's a lot of political ideologies that are flying in different ways. What you need to understand is that most of these ideologies are sometimes propagated through these absurd private learning institutions or religious schools in themselves, because states do not have absolute control in terms of how the system of this schooling works in and of themselves. But more importantly, we think when you look at places like the United States of America, where the curriculum in and of itself can be very different in terms of what is educated within those places, we think you're more likely not going to see like a universal educational system that happens in that particular narrative. But more importantly, the conversation about school choice in and of itself is a fight between what dominant narrative should be used to groom these children in schools. And that is why you are more likely going to have these alternative schools trying to propagate different narratives, indoctrinate different standards that are opposed to what states might want to do in this debate. This particular argument is important because you need to understand that when we support things like public education, You reinforce civic education and promote state loyalty to prevent any form of counter-educative narrative that will be propagated by these schools in and of themselves. We think this is important because the idea of school choice, particularly in liberal democracies, allow for different institutions to have different schooling patterns in and of themselves. It means at the end of the day, in our world, we can preserve states' ability to have control over what exactly needs to be taught on a universal basis to these children in and of themselves. We think this is particularly important because you are more likely going to see this in high schools in themselves, where the schooling system is very important for those children in themselves, not particularly within places like tertiary institutions. We think the high school system, secondary schools in themselves, are the most important school system where these narratives need to be propagated. The next thing we then need to talk about is that we think that a strong public education system contributes to an informed and active citizenry, which is vital for the function of a democratic state, particularly liberal democracies. For people to be able to understand their rights, they need to be heavily educated. We think you polarize the educational system when you support things like school choices that creates different type of schooling patterns where some heavy priority is given on certain institutions. Others are more likely not going to get that same kind of treatment. You get better analysis from my whip. Proud to propose.
Thank the member of government for that great speech. To extend the negative case, let's hear from the opposition member. Here.
Guys, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Before you start, can I please? I'd like to ask every speaker to check if their mic is muted. Only opposition members should be unmuted right now. Yeah, speakers, please check.
All right. So, guys, I'm not really sure. I'm within the church building, so probably there might be a background noise. I'm not sure. Can you guys please confirm before I start? Like, is there any background noise that would disrupt my presentation?
We can hear you well enough. Don't worry about that.
All right. Cool. So, at
Sorry.
any point when it starts getting too overwhelming, you can tell me. Yeah, cool. So I'm just saying, if ever it starts getting overwhelming, just call me. Cool. So preferred pronouns he, him. With your eyes, I'll take it for 4th minute because there's a lot of context that I need to give. So yeah, you might need to first of all listen before you ask. And then what else? All right. Yeah, I think I'll start my speech in 3, 2,
before you start
1.
your speech, before you
the
start,
reason why, yeah.
Member of
Yes.
government, please mute your mic.
Hey, that you like even in 5,000 you spend for her.
7.
Oh, I did not mean to disconnect you.
All right, I'll just wait till he joins then. What's that?
So, government whip, please get your partner back.
Yeah.
I don't think they were
Also,
in the
can
room
I?
before anyway, okay, they're back now.
Oh, they're here now.
Yes. So you can
Oh,
begin your speech whenever
okay,
you're
cool,
ready.
great. Muted. Also, can I opt out of the, the live streaming? I don't know. Is it possible? If not, then it's cool. I'll start. Just tell me it's not. I'm joking.
That's been fine.
Right. Ah, no, that's okay. It's fine. It's fine. I'll start my speech in three, two, one. The reason why Kateho from Opening Government, or whoever her name was, goes to a school that's dusty and everything is because government has failed in its mandate to allocate resources to public schools. This is a definition of public schools that which Opening Government doesn't give you in this instance. That is to say that there is really no call-out mechanism that exists when government doesn't partner with private schools to get middle-class people into these private schools and to give them that kind of access, right? I'll deal with the rebuttals in a couple of minutes. The first thing that I want to do in this debate is to primarily bring you to the context of why exactly we're having this debate in the first place. This is not a debate about whether or not there should be inclusivity within democratic spaces, even though that's important. This is also not a debate about whether or not government has primarily got that mandate, even though that's important. This is also not a debate about whether or not we should have one ideology within liberal democracies, even though we'll still acknowledge that, right? This is a debate about the school system itself and why it is the most pivotal in terms of advancing liberal democracy within this particular instance. This is a debate about breaking down echo chambers. Opening opposition talks about how, like in the vast majority of cases, liberal democracies are created through the breakdown of like conservative structures through social movements and etc. Right? This means that if you are to maximize on the element of liberal democracy in itself, you ought to break down echo chambers that exist. And we think that the only way to break down these echo chambers is by giving access to individuals to these private schools that which create the sort of like conservative and one ideology type of like education, which by the way we think is the only reason why like things like conservatism would survive and why liberal democracies are less likely not going to thrive. So the reason why echo chambers should be broken, I think this is probably the first piece of context that I need to give you to say why literally should echo chambers be broken down in a liberal democracy. It is to say that because where in echo chambers are not broken down, you don't get to have that interaction with privilege, and therefore you don't get to then advance liberal ideas because of that element of individuals being taught one ideology. CG comes to the debate and almost tackles on why the school system is necessarily pivotal, but then they lose the debate when they start talking about how we need to preach one ideology. We think that this is something that's inherently wrong. We don't think that there is a necessity for you to preach one ideology, but there is a necessity for you to have a conversation and an interaction within spaces that preach one ideology. We think CG is probably the team that gets the fourth within this debate. Couple of engagements here. Firstly, for closing governments, not just giving them in the leave this debate. Firstly, they talk about how like states don't necessarily have access to these private schools. Like we think that the best way to give access to states to these private schools is by allowing for governments to partner with these private schools so that they relax their conservative laws. And we think that the relaxation of conservative laws means that you are being pro-government choice or being pro-government policy, which means that government gets to have then that interaction and gets to have that access to these private schools and can then change whatever ideology, assuming that we wanted the ideology to be a universal ideology. We are proud to defend that. Second thing that they lose on in this debate is the idea of why government needs to keep people educated. Firstly, they don't tell us why that education doesn't need to be polarized, because we think that the polarization of education allows for the interaction of all these like different conservative ideologies to achieve one liberal stance, and we think that that's something that's important in this debate. So keeping people educated should not exist within spaces where people are confined and have conservative ideology. We don't think that public schools, firstly, give that kind of education, but secondly, we think we don't maximize on that education when we don't break down conservative structures. OG comes to the debate, talks about call-out mechanisms. We don't think that call-out mechanisms exist when people don't have an influx to private schools where they have better access to education and etc. Because they firstly are complacent, but secondly, they don't have the access and the privilege to go to these private schools. So they can't necessarily say we are going to call out the government where they don't have an access to any alternatives, and that's why alternatives are particularly important within this debate. Three pieces of context in this debate: firstly, pluralism; secondly, progressivism; and then thirdly, questions on why necessarily we advance things like privilege, and why we give like why we maximize on government policy and etc. under our side. Opening opposition talks about inclusivity, talks about optics and etc. We already know that these things are necessary within a liberal democracies. We think they've been disingenuous to this motion because they've told you why the debate is itself is particularly about the school system and why all these things are maximized within the school system. And this is exactly what I'm about to talk about. Firstly, we think that like when you break down school structures and you allow for the penetration of people from the low class into the people of the high class, you allow for pluralism and you allow for like people to engage with the privilege that exists within those private schools. What do I mean by this? Rich people are less likely going to go to public schools.
Chair, I believe the speaker has been disconnected.
Yes, it seems so. Maybe I'll put where he stopped in the chat and I will start a timer. Opposition whip, you can just check on your partner, try to get them back promptly.
Yeah, sure. Please give me a minute.
So great. I'm back now. I'm not really sure if there's anyone who's speaking, but currently I disconnected.
That's fine.
Confirm I'm audible.
You're audible. I paused your timer at 4 minutes
Hello.
54 seconds. Can you hear me?
Wow. Yes, I can. 4 minutes. Right.
Yeah, so 4 minutes 54
4 minutes
seconds.
what?
54 seconds. You're talking about how in pluralism and how rich people can now mix.
Uh, okay. Mm, all right, fine. So I've got like 2 minutes to go. Um, okay, I'll restart my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. So yeah, the last point was on how rich people get to engage with their privilege only at a time when we allow for pluralism and allow for the conversation of like different ideologies within these public schools, and that like rich people aren't going to go to public schools and etc. Right. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about was on the idea of how like there is much more accountability. Like government are going to go to public schools and etc. Right. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about was on the idea of how like there is much more accountability, like government accountability when they maximize on their mandate to break down conservative spaces, because that is where like the threat to liberalism necessarily lies, where like conservative spaces necessarily thrive. So we think that the access to alternatives, which like opening opposition tries to argue in this debate, is best maximized under our side, where we tell you that school systems in and of themselves is best impacted rather under our side. We tell you that school systems need to maximize, like need to to give access to alternatives in order for government to maximize on its mandate to break down conservative structures. We think that that's better accountability than the one that you get from government teams, right? And then also on the idea of progressivism, we're talking about how progressivism in and of itself is best maximized when there is an interaction of different ideologies altogether, because that's where you can then call out specific elements of whatever conservative structure is there that which directly affects liberalism or that which directly goes against government policy. Because the definition, or rather the thing with like conservative spaces, is that oftentimes they go against government policy. So we need to have that interaction to say, okay, this is what government policy looks like, and this is how we think that we can best maximize on you reaching out to like other individuals through like the element of government policy and etc. I think that there's more progressivism after breaking down the structures. And then like being that the question that needs to be answered in today's debate is, where do we get better engagement with privilege? It is under the side where government like gets to engage, like gets to directly give access to people from these poor status communities to privileged schools where they are going to get access to better education because they've already failed with government schools. And also, why is access necessarily limited? Because it is hard to penetrate these like private schools. So because like poor people can't go to these private schools because either one, you aren't of that religion or etc., it becomes incredibly hard. There's much more access on our side. Lastly, where do you get maximization of government policy? We think that it best happens on our side because government has
Member of that's time. We thank the member of opposition for
failed
that
to
great speech. To conclude the government case, let's hear from the government whip. Hear, hear.
Hey guys, am I audible?
You are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, Ajake, I'll take a POI. So when it's past 4 minutes, you can type in the chat space and then I'll take you. But if I'm not taking you because maybe I might not be looking, you can then unmute and just say POI verbally. Just hold on. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Let me start by taking out closing opposition because I think their arguments are at the end quite inconsequential. They said two things. The first thing they said is to tackle what my partner gave you, and they said that the state did not need to preach only one idea and there need to be several ideas. So basically what my partner said about preserving loyalty to the state and all of that basically means that you're only going to have one idea, and that is anti the spirit of liberalism and what it means. Two responses. The first one is that he's playing a semantic trick. He's trying to kind of confuse what liberalism means. Liberalism can only exist if the state has the loyalty of the people and the people respects the state's machinery to grant the rights to everybody. That also means then that if we are seeing extremist fashions and other forms of expressions that are hurting other groups of people, the state has a responsibility to make sure that those machineries do not spread enough and preach a lot of anti-state rhetorics. To be fair, yeah, we think the idea is that there needs to be one overarching ideology that supersedes all of them. And what is that one? That one is a respect for state sovereignty and a respect for what democracy itself is. Because he doesn't pay attention to the nuance of what my partner gives you. We don't think for the sake of liberalism, the state needs to shut up and let, like a liberal democracy needs to shut up and let a group of people preach things like communism and preach things like, oh no, democracy is bad, capitalism is bad, everybody is stupid. Like we need to, these kind of narratives are acting actively hurting the state itself from keeping the peace that exists in that particular liberal democracy. At that point in time, the state is not obliged to spend and shell out money to make sure that these people also get the school choice that they want. That is a response that they fail to give to you. And we think what we are saying is not to say, oh no, we only need one ideology. No. Like liberalism is fine. You can believe in whatever you want. But to the point where it is anti the state doesn't need to fund that. Let's move on to opening opposition. Okay, no, the other thing that CO tells you is to say that progressivism can best exist when several ideas can interact with each other for social advancement. Ironically, you only get that on our side. Do you know why? Because in CO's world, you allow parents to take their kids to all white private schools, or take their kids to all black private schools, or to take their Muslim kids to Islamic schools, or take their Catholic children to Catholic schools. That literally looks like segregation in its highest forms. That means you don't get the level of contact theory and social interaction that public schools at their best will give you in the world that CO wants. So if he wants people to interact and understand each other, the only way you can get that is if you let people go to public schools and get that interaction. Let's move on to OO then. OO says two things, right? The first thing is that they say the state does not have the resources to make public schools better, hence they need to outsource to the private sector. This argument doesn't matter in this debate, because the debate is not about whether private schools need to exist or not. Like, a lot of universities are even public universities, like private universities and public universities, and the states can sometimes try to regulate them. What that means then is that if, for example, if the state was able to like just get some money to give people unemployment checks and stimulus checks when they think it was dire enough, I don't know why the states cannot get money to make public schools better. The burden on gov teams is not to spend 7 minutes analyzing that the states can make public schools better so that like private schools prove that if we give out money to support, it will promote segregation and promote other traits and allow people to indoctrinate their kids wrongly to the point that would literally hurt the existence of liberal democracy. That is the conversation that we are having, right? OO then tells you the second thing. They say that district schools are underfunded and they will not get better anytime soon. So like the state needs to then give scholarships to people to take their kids to whatever schools that they want to take them to. This argument is counterintuitive. Scholarship is funded by state money. So if the state needs money to make public schools better, why do we need to give that same money to one kid to be taken on scholarship, to be taken to a private school that their parents chooses? At best, we can cancel school choicism altogether and use all the cumulative money that we would have spent in giving out scholarships to make district schools better. Like, if the issue is about funding, then we can take the funding from OO's world and use that to make public schools better, because over there, the states can have a direct control over what is being taught to make sure that the very idea beneath liberal democracies is not threatened. Now that OO is out of the debate, I'll take your POI. Shoot. OO, what's your POI?
Okay, if the context of your debate is you want government to indoctrinate people about the ideologies and their protectionist of the state and all of those, why do you necessarily think government cannot do that? Since we analyzed that they control the policies and every of the mechanisms that exist around other types of schools existing, like they can still control the curriculum and all of those. Your world is still not comparative; it's extremist.
No, hold up. No. Yeah, that's the problem, right? Private schools, religious schools, and a lot of other schools just springing up over time are just getting too many for the states to catch up. Like, just be charitable. The population of the United States, if you have every minority community having some sort of and they just want to apply to the district to get like money to go and take their kids on scholarship there, how long do you think the states can catch up to make sure they are compliant with curriculum, to make sure they are compliant with racial admissions? Like, these guys can literally discriminate against the people that they want to admit into their schools, and the states would not probably even know, because they're simply schools is the most logical and simple way to deal with this. But also, panel, now moving on to weighing our matter and why we win. Up teams don't give you any justification for why the state needs to spend the money to do this. Because even if all they tell you, all the fancy things they tell you are true, the idea of supporting school choice in and of itself requires the government to use taxpayers' money to divert that money from, making public schools better, to giving it to these guys to do all black schools, all white schools, all Muslim schools, and all Catholic schools. They don't give you that justification, and we think the state is only justified to spend money in those instances in three main ways. First, if that money is going to lead to more equitable outcomes, and they did not show you that. But secondly, if that particular section is in so much dire need of the state funds that there is a principal obligation on the state to support them out of a moral case. They don't give you any reason why all white schools, all black schools, all Muslim schools are like so terrible right now that they need the state to give them that money and give them that support. We win over them. What two cases did my partner give you? The first one was about state preservation and how in liberal democracies, they are trying to experience, they are currently experiencing state breakdown because there are fascist and communist groups and all other ideas that are being rampant. If you go on social media, literally, there are people that are backlashing the state and saying that the state is terrible, blah, 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 they need this, they need that, they need that. That basically means then that the state needs to make sure that there is some level of standardization in education that the young people are receiving. Do you know how public schools do that? Because of three things. Public schools enforces contact theory because like black kids, white kids, people from all backgrounds get to interact with each other. Secondly, public schools get to teach reinforced shared values by organizing people to participate in school competitions and all of that. We are the only team that show you what is happening on the grounds realistically in 2024, and we take it up.
Whip. We thank the government whip for that great speech. To conclude the debate as a whole, I'd now like to call the
Other teams, right?
opposition whip. Here, here.
All right, can I just confirm that I'm audible before I start?
You are.
Excellent. So for POIs, I'll be looking at the chat space, so just be sure to put them there, and I'll probably have you at like for the 5th minute, right? So yeah, just to keep track of time. So in any case, if I do disconnect, please just quickly let me know, but that's very unlikely. And if you can't hear me, just also let me know in the chat space, and I'll be sure to stop. All right, so if everything is okay, preferred pronouns are he or they, and I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. So panel, the most important thing we need to understand within this debate is that it seeks to establish whether choice of school should exist, right? Which means that ultimately you're still going to have private schools, you're going to have religious schools, but you're simply debating whether there should be integration of these schools where people can be allowed to go to other forms of school. That's why we're talking about things such as government scholarships and subsidies to allow poor communities and government and parents to be able to send their children to schools, right? This important piece of clarification from CO is particularly important, right? So there are several reasons why CG falls completely out of this debate, right? So I'll start firstly with engaging with CG, right? What CG basically tells us is that they want something like a universal ideology which somehow preaches loyalty to the state, because they think at a point in which you allow people to preach different ideologies, then that's necessarily problematic. Couple of responses to this, right? Firstly, we don't think that it leads to disloyalty in anyhow, because we think the citizens themselves are aware that they live within a liberal democracy that caters to individual rights such as freedom of religion and freedom of speech and whatsoever, right? So we think at a point in which they are given the freedom to sort of access spaces that they are more comfortable with, we think on the alternate, in fact, the opposite. We think they are more likely to be loyal to the state, which they feel more connected with because it allows them to express themselves. So we think we think different educational patterns preach the opposite, right, and actually achieve the opposite, contrary to what CG says, right? But they also have this idea around how a universal ideology is something that liberal democracies want, right? But a couple of responses to this, right? This is very problematic because we think liberal democracies themselves thrive at a point in which they're able to pride themselves in the fact that they promote diversity and freedom and individual freedoms, right? That's why we have minimal government interference, right? We think the very ideology or the very foundation of these democracies is that their citizens are very happy and they're able to express themselves. So we think that they are not likely to adhere, or it's not in their best interest to adhere to a universal ideology that preaches or indoctrinates people. So we think this is highly problematic, right? This is why Z in his speech particularly explains to you why it's important to break down echo chambers, right? Because what we necessarily tell you is that in government's world, where you have more funding towards public schools, even if we have to take them at their best and we say public schools are able to be funded, they're able to have all these resources, we think the elite and the rich on their own are unlikely to adhere to such schools, right? They are unable to send their children to such schools. Why do we think it's particularly true? We think it's true because the elite and the connected and the rich themselves are much more likely to still prefer the elitist schools, the Harvards and whatsoever, because we think they pride themselves in exclusivity themselves, which is exactly why Z tells you about segregation and echo chambers, on why at a point in which you allow the poorer communities and the more marginalized communities to get into these elitist schools, then you break down these echo chambers at their very grassroots. And at that point, you take away the exclusivity that the rich pride themselves in, which we think is something that's more likely. Because even if you overfund public schools, we still think that a certain portion of society within these liberal democracies, especially the elite who are very conservative and who are very elitist in their nature, are unlikely to adhere to public schools. So at any point, you still have a huge level of segregation, right? But also, this directly engages with Serge's argument on about how it's important to know your rights and education and whatsoever, and preaching one identity. Now, panel, note, this is very problematic, right? Because we think that even if you overfund public schools, like we say, you still don't have the rich going to these schools. So segregation still exists because schools are completely exclusive, and you're not giving the marginalized communities the resources to access this schools, right? And you're creating these echo chambers, right? So people hardly interact with each other. So you still, at the end of the day, have movements such as Black Lives Matter, because at the end you still have primary white or privileged schools, right? This is exactly why Z talks about pluralism and why it's important for integration, right? So we think this is something that CG completely fails to adhere to, right? So before I get on to CG, your POI.
So it's very contradictory that you say that in a world where we build public schools the way we want, elitists would not attend these schools. What is better than your world that intentionally propagates and fuel that narrative actively so that they now have schools where they can go to, than our world where you are going to claim, oh, they would still live regardless. But
Now, panel,
engage.
notice the failure to engage with our core argument, right, panel? We say in our world, whereas the elite are not likely to adhere to the public schools, because even though they are overfunded, because they are hugely elitist in their own beliefs, we think giving access and giving resources to poorer communities to access elite schools is much better, because then it creates a more cohesive society where access is particularly important to disenfranchised communities. Now, in our world, what you inherently get is poor communities being able to go to elite schools, right? Which means you take away the level of exclusivity that they have, whereas in their world, the rich remain the rich, and at any point they remain within their schools, and the poor remain in their schools. And in any case, you don't have any level of engagement, and you still have movements such as the Black Lives Matter, because because these communities are not doing any better anyhow, and they are not interacting. You have created this echo chambers, right? So we think this is very problematic from CG, but let's deal with OG, right? OG has this whole idea around how governments have a direct influence on schools and whatsoever, right? And we think this is hugely problematic, right? Because they say it's not the mandate of government to put the bill, right? But we think at a point in which citizens' taxes are directly poured towards poorer communities and more marginalized communities to give them the resources to send their children to private schools, to more expensive schools, we think at any point it's still a legitimate government mandate within liberal democracies, right? Because we think the direction of citizens' taxes is not something that's problematic at a point in which the very citizens themselves are able to send their children to private schools. So we think that's hugely problematic coming from OO, right? So we don't think that's something that's principally bad anyhow, right? Because you're not enriching anyone who is not worth enriching, right? So we think at any point this point falls away, right? So why do we think that we tell you something much more important that comes from OO, right? We give you an idea around pluralism, right? Around how diversity of viewpoints is particularly important and perspectives in society. Because, panel, we tell you that different ways of thinking within the school system is something that will allow for a more tolerant society that is more aligned with liberal democracies and their values, right? Because at a point in which you have an interaction of thoughts and discourses, you're likely to create a more cohesive society that understands and that preaches tolerance, right? But at a point in which you completely segregate people and religious schools exist with no non-religious people getting into such spaces, and elitist schools exist where poor people not getting into such spaces, you don't have any tolerance, because there's lack of understanding, there's lack of cohesion even at the grassroots level. So this is why pluralism is particularly important. But more importantly, panel, we think at our point we break down barriers between communities, neighborhoods, and already segregated by class and race and such issues. So at a point in which you allow them to interact, you break down these barriers. And lastly, we tell you that poor people are able to access spaces we had never been prouder to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for that great speech and congratulate all teams for the amazing octo-final. At this point, I think it's definitely a silent round because it's an out round. I wish you all Godspeed and best and the best of luck in the upcoming rounds. The judges will just go to K7 deliberation. So thank you again.